Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good whatever time you may be viewing this. So, in this lecture, in chapter 11 here, we're going to review and talk about the central nervous system. So, the central nervous system is one of the kind of subdivisions of our overarching general nervous system. So, one of our bodily systems. The central nervous system is going to be one of the divisions of that. So you can contrast the central nervous system with the peripheral nervous system. And in this lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the peripheral nervous system. We'll throw in a few things. But largely, we'll talk about the central nervous system. So the main components of the central nervous system are going to be the brain and its associated structures, along with the spinal cord and its associated structures. But in future parts of this lecture, we'll also talk about some spinal nerves, so we'll talk a little bit about peripheral, but we'll focus primarily on central. So to begin here, I want you to look at this quote, and I want you to think about what it means. So this quote says, if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. All right, and this was by the physicist Emerson Pugh. And so to me, what this means, or what he's saying here, is that the complexity of our brain and then in relation to that, how complex we are in our ability to think, this complexity of our brain kind of inherently leads us to this conclusion that we're not going to be able to understand everything, right? And so even if we were to make our brain more simple, if we were to somehow simplify the brain, simplify its structure, simplify its functionality, by virtue of doing that, we would make ourselves more simple, and by doing so, we would be unable to understand it in its function. So what they're saying, if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, by virtue of making it more simple, less complex, it would make us more simple, less complex, to the point where we would not be able to understand it. And so this is something to keep in mind as we talk about the central nervous system, and as we talk about the nervous system in general, is that there are lots of features to it, and this class is in no way, or this lecture is in no way in no way trying to cover every single aspect of the nervous system or of the central nervous system, of the brain, of the spinal cord. But we are trying to talk about it in a little bit of detail and mention some of the important structures. So this complexity of the brain that we've alluded to can somewhat be represented by a graph that looks something like this. So we have all of these branches off of the nervous system. And so we can see all of these different branches, talking about features of the nervous system, talking about parts of neurons, talking about the kind of action potential all up in this region here. And so what we'll do really with this lecture and some of the remaining lectures is we'll take this very complex graph here with all of these branching points, and we'll simplify it into something that looks something like this. So we can take our nervous system in general here, and we can simplify it into central and peripheral, and then from there we can branch down and discuss more specific parts in specific lectures, right? So for this lecture, we're going to focus primarily on CNS. We'll throw in a little bit of peripheral nervous system and a little bit of sensory as well. But we'll have future lectures on sensory. We'll have future lectures on motor as well. And we'll also have future lectures on the autonomic nervous system down here as well. So whenever we talk about organizing our nervous system, we can organize our nervous system into a couple of different classes, or in a couple of different ways. We can organize it structurally. So we can look at the structure of the nervous system. What does it look like? What is its structure? What is its form? So the physical properties. We can organize it functionally. So we'll discuss when we look at the brain specifically that there are specific structures of the brain, and within those structures there are specific functional regions, or what we will call functional areas. So we can organize it functionally as well. And we'll also throughout this term briefly call it topographical organization, or the brain has a topography to it. And this kind of alludes to the fact that specific structures in our body, whether it is receiving, or our brain is receiving sensory information from that area of the body, or our brain is sending out motor signals to that area of the body, there's a specific region in the brain that is dedicated specifically to that. So whenever you stub your toe, or whenever you slam your hand in a door, that sensation, that pain sensation that you perceive is perceived by a different region of the brain, right? So this is how you can tell something is coming from your finger versus when something is coming from your toe or your foot, right? Likewise, motor information that is going out to the periphery, that's going to the fingers, originates in a part of the brain different from signals that are going out to the toe or to the knee or to the head or to the trunk, right? So we have this specific topography, we have this specific arrangement and layout of neurons according to the area of the body that they are associated with. Okay, so some of the functions of our nervous system is we know that our nervous system can collect information, right? So we can receive some type of stimuli, right? So we have specific receptors, sensory receptors, and we'll talk about these in a future lecture, that this receptor responds to a specific stimulus, right? And it responds to a specific stimulus and only that stimulus, right? So thermoreceptors only respond to changes in temperature. Nociceptors respond only to pain. Mechanoreceptors only respond to physical or mechanical stimuli, right? So we can collect information. If you can hear me talking right now, or if you can see your screen that you're watching this on, you are collecting information, right? You're collecting light information. You are collecting auditory information, okay? Once this information is collected, we can go to the second function here where we process and we evaluate that information. So we say, okay, what is it that what is this sensory stimulus that I'm receiving? What does it mean? What can I do to process it? How can I evaluate it? And so this has in part due to our ability to perceive things. And so we'll talk about this difference between sensation and perception. But in general, sensation is occurring at the level of the sensory receptor. So where a stimulus, a chemical, some temperature, mechanical stimulus, whatever, stimulates a sensory receptor. That is sensation. Now, not all sensations are we made aware of it, right? So we don't perceive every little thing that is happening, and that's largely a good thing. And so this idea between sensation and perception is that once we become aware of the sensation, we become aware of whatever the stimulus is, we are said to have perceived it, right? So we become consciously aware, right? And then we can begin to initiate some type of response, right? So you may be walking, right? You may hear a loud noise, so you collect information. You may begin to process and evaluate that noise, so you may associate it with previous noises that you may have heard before, and then you do something, right? So you initiate some type of response. And so, say this is a dangerous stimulus, right? There's a car honking, or there's somebody screaming, right? Based on our previous knowledge, our prior knowledge, we can initiate some type of response. And the way we initiate a response, really, in general, all throughout the nervous system, is we stimulate something called an effector. And so our effectors can be muscles, they can be glands, but in general, the effector is the structure that is doing something, right? So in the case of moving our legs or moving our arms or our neck or our trunk or something, the effector would be muscles, right? So we stimulate muscles, they contract, they pull on our bones, and we move. We could also it could be a gland, right? So we could stimulate a gland to produce saliva or to produce oil or to produce sweat or produce whatever. But the effector is the thing that is doing something in response to us receiving a stimulus, sensing it, and then having some effect, right? So here in this graph down here, we can see structural organization. We can also see functional organization. So structure is referring to central versus peripheral nervous system, to the actual form, the structure, whereas functional is referring to sensory versus motor, and that's what we'll talk about next with sensory information. So sensory information, if you think about our senses, this is information that is coming into our central nervous system, right? We are receiving some type of stimulus, and this stimulus could be a chemical, it could be pressure, touch, vibration, it could be pain, it could be any of these different things. And so sensory information is coming into the nervous system. Now, another term for sensory is the term afferent or afferent, right? I will primarily use the term afferent because the A, we're going to also see, we can think of sensory information as arriving, so arriving at the central nervous system. So I'll call this afferent nervous system, right? So we are receiving sensory information from the receptors, and it's coming into the nervous system, right? The receptors could be anywhere. These could be receptors in the skin. This could be receptors in our muscles, in our organs. And whenever we do our separate lecture on general sensation and special senses, we'll see that we have certain sensory receptors that respond to certain things, and they're located in very specific areas, right? So with our sensory or our afferent nervous system, we can subdivide this into two general parts. One is somatic and one is visceral. When you think somatic, think of the term soma, and soma refers to body. And so this is coming from our body wall, things like our muscles and things like our skin. So if we have information coming to our central nervous system from our skin, that is coming back to the central nervous system via a somatic afferent or a somatic afferent or sensory neuron, right? So this is coming back into the central nervous system. So if you scrape your arm, you shut your finger in a door, right? You have some type of pressure or vibration or touch on your skin. You have a stretch of a muscle. All of this is coming back to our central nervous system, and we are made aware of it via the somatic afferent nervous system. So if somatic is body wall and skin and muscles, visceral is kind of everything else. And so the term viscera or visceral refers to our organs, our internal organs. And so this has to do with information that we don't perceive it. We can perceive sensory information from our viscera or visceral organs, but in general, sometimes we don't, right? So if we have information coming back from our kidneys or our heart, like you see in the example here, maybe from the lungs, from the stomach, from the intestines, we're not always made very well. We're not made aware of that, right? So if we have constriction of our blood vessels to go from a certain size lumen down to something smaller, we're not conscious of that, right? We don't perceive that as happening. You can't tell right now that your vessels are changing in shape and changing in size, right? So this has to do with the term visceral afferent. So again, that term viscera means organ, okay? So if you know what sensory is, then you know what motor is, because sensory is coming into the central nervous system. So motor is leaving the central nervous system. So we said sensory was called afferent. Motor is also referred to as efferent or efferent, okay? But again, I'm going to emphasize the efferent, because motor nervous system, or this efferent, is exiting the central nervous system, okay? Where it's going to specific structures called effectors, and the effectors were what we mentioned earlier. So muscles, glands, these are something that actually carry out whatever activity we're trying to have occur, right? So we're trying to contract our muscles. We're trying to turn our head or our neck. We're trying to increase our heart rate. We're trying to contract the smooth muscle in our stomach, right? So whatever the effector is, that's what actually carries out our response, right? And so like our sensory, we can also have somatic and what we can also kind of refer to as visceral or autonomic. So again, the term soma refers to our body, and so this is primarily information going to our skeletal muscles. Now, if you think back to our histology, and you think about muscle tissue, is skeletal muscle voluntary or involuntary? Well, hopefully you remember that skeletal muscle is our only voluntary type of muscle tissue, meaning it's under conscious control. We can consciously decide to contract or not to contract our skeletal muscle. So you can contrast this with your autonomic nervous system. So your autonomic nervous system is going to be sending out motor information, so efferent signals, to structures that we do not consciously control. Okay, we cannot exert voluntary conscious control over these things. So these are things like the functionality of our organs, so the rate that our heart is beating, innervation to our lungs, to smooth muscle, right? So if you remember, smooth and cardiac muscle were both involuntarily stimulated, right? And so we can take this autonomic motor system, this autonomic nervous system, and subdivide it into two further divisions called sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So you may have heard of sympathetic and parasympathetic. If you haven't, you've likely heard of fight or flight or rest and digest. So sympathetic is the quote-unquote fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic is the quote-unquote rest and digest system, okay? These, for the most part, have opposite effects. So whereas, so the sympathetic nervous system may cause the heart rate to increase, whereas the parasympathetic would cause heart rate to decrease. Sympathetic would slow down digestive activity. Parasympathetic would increase digestive activity, all right? So they largely have opposite functions. That's kind of an oversimplification of it, but you can generally think of it in that sense for now. We'll have a totally separate lecture on autonomic nervous system, and we'll look at where these nervous systems originate in the central nervous system. So we'll see sympathetic occurs in the thoracic and lumbar regions, and parasympathetic occurs in the cranial and sacral regions of the spinal cord, all right, in the brain. And so they start in different places, they have different functions, but for now, know sympathetic fight or flight, increasing things, so you can think of things in a fight or flight response. You have to do something to either fight somebody, you have to exert physical effort, or you'll flee and run away. And then parasympathetic is you're resting and digesting. So pupils are going to be constricted, heart rate's going to be low, blood pressure is going to be low, respiratory rate's going to be low, things like that. All right. So keep those in mind as we move forward here. Okay. So again, here's our functional organization. So we have our sensory aspect here, or the afferent. So again, remember sensory is analogous or synonymous to the term afferent with an A. Motor, on the other hand, is synonymous with the term efferent with an E or efferent. And think about where these are traveling with respect to the central nervous system. So sensory is coming into the central nervous system, whereas motor is going out. And then you can think down here some of the subdivisions. So somatic and visceral, somatic and autonomic, and what those functions are going to be for each of those divisions. All right. So we'll stop there, and we'll pick up with part 2 in the next lecture.